The winter wind howled like a banshee against the stone walls of Ravenscroft Manor as I urged my horse through the driving snow. Each gust seemed determined to turn me back, as if nature itself conspired to keep me from this place. Perhaps I should have listened. Perhaps I should have found any excuse to avoid answering her summons. But duty, that cruel master I had served faithfully for 32 years, demanded I press forward through the December storm. My name is Tobias Ashworth, and I have built my reputation on reliability. As an estate manager, I have never failed to answer a call for assistance, never shirked a responsibility, never allowed personal feelings to interfere with professional obligations. Yet as Ravenscroft's towering silhouette emerged from the white curtain of snow, I felt that carefully constructed composure begin to crack. Lady Catherine Pembroke. Even thinking her name sent an unwelcome tremor through my chest. For 8 months, I had successfully avoided any direct contact with the widow of Ravenscroft Manor. Not from disrespect, mind you, but from something far more dangerous. The woman had awakened feelings in me that no married lady should inspire in a gentleman. Even now, with her husband Lord Pembroke dead these past 8 months, I knew the wisdom of keeping my distance. But her letter had been urgent. Estate matters requiring immediate attention, she wrote. Legal complications that demanded my expertise before week's end. As the most trusted estate manager in 3 counties, I could hardly refuse such a plea, especially during the treacherous winter season when travel would soon become impossible. I dismounted in the courtyard, my boots crunching through snow that reached nearly to my knees. The stable boy who emerged to take my horse looked relieved to see any living soul brave enough to venture out in such weather. He guided my mount toward warmth while I gathered my leather satchel of documents and made my way to the manor's imposing oak doors. The heavy brass knocker seemed to echo endlessly through the halls beyond. When the door finally opened, I expected to see Mrs. Hartwell, the longtime housekeeper. Instead, candlelight flickered across a face that had haunted my thoughts for far too long. Lady Catherine Pembroke stood before me, and I felt my carefully rehearsed professional demeanor desert me entirely. She wore a simple dress of deep blue wool, practical yet elegant, with her auburn hair gathered loosely at the nape of her neck. The small scar along her left temple, barely visible in the golden candlelight, caught my attention as it always had. Where others saw a flaw from her childhood riding accident, I had always found it captivating, a mark of character that spoke to her spirited nature. She smiled, and I noticed something I had never seen before during our previous, properly chaperoned encounters. Relief. Genuine, overwhelming relief that transformed her entire countenance. "Mr. Ashworth," she said, stepping aside to welcome me into the warmth. "I cannot tell you how grateful I am that you came. I was beginning to fear the storm would prevent any travel." I removed my snow-laden cloak and hat, acutely aware that we were alone. Propriety demanded I inquire about other household members, about chaperones, about the very circumstances that should have sent me immediately back into the storm. "Lady Pembroke," I managed, my voice rougher than intended from the cold journey. "Your message spoke of urgent estate matters. I trust you are well." She took my outer garments, her fingers briefly brushing mine as she accepted them. Even that innocent contact sent awareness shooting through my system like lightning through a winter sky. "I am well, thank you. Though I confess the circumstances are rather more complex than I indicated in my correspondence." She gestured toward the great hall, where a fire crackled invitingly in the massive stone hearth. "Please, come warm yourself. Mrs. Hartwell has prepared chambers for you, as travel back to town in this weather would be impossible." As I followed her into the hall, I noticed the way candlelight danced across the ancient tapestries and carved stone walls. Ravenscroft had always been a magnificent estate, but tonight it felt different. Intimate. The storm had transformed it into something like a refuge from the world, a place where normal rules might not apply. We settled into chairs before the fire, and I opened my satchel to withdraw the various documents I thought might be needed for estate business. But when I looked up, I found Catherine watching me with an expression that made my pulse quicken. "There is something I must confess," she began, her hands folded carefully in her lap. "The urgent estate matter I mentioned in my letter. It is real, but perhaps not quite as I presented it." A warning bell sounded in my mind. I had built my career on reading people, on understanding the motivations behind their words. Whatever had brought me to Ravenscroft tonight, it was not a simple matter of property management. "I am afraid I do not understand, my lady." She rose and moved to the window, where snow continued its relentless assault against the diamond-paned glass. For a long moment, she simply stood there, candlelight creating a halo around her silhouette. My husband's brother, Lord Mortimer Pembroke, intends to claim this estate, she said finally. He arrives within days, bringing legal documents that will force me from my home. He has also made it clear that he expects me to marry a gentleman of his choosing to secure his control over the property. The words hit me like a physical blow. I knew Mortimer Pembroke by reputation, a cruel and calculating man who viewed widows as inconvenient obstacles to be removed. But the thought of Catherine being forced into an unwanted marriage stirred something primitive and fierce within my chest. What grounds does he have for such a claim? I asked, my professional instincts engaging despite the personal turmoil. Debts, she replied simply. My husband, God rest his soul, was not as careful with finances as he might have been. Mortimer has documentation proving the estate owes substantial sums. Under law, he can claim guardianship over both the property and my future. I studied her profile in the firelight, noting the determined set of her shoulders despite the obvious distress in her voice. Here was a woman who had managed this vast estate largely alone during her husband's frequent absences, who had earned the respect and loyalty of every tenant and servant. The thought of her being reduced to a pawn in Mortimer's ambitions was intolerable. Why did you summon me, Catherine? The use of her Christian name slipped out before I could stop it, but she did not correct me. She turned from the window, and in her eyes, I saw something that made my breath catch. It was not mere desperation or even fear. It was hope, fragile and dangerous, mixed with something that looked remarkably like affection. Because, she said softly, you are the only man I trust completely. And because I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that you might help me find a way to fight back. Outside, the storm continued its assault on Ravenscroft Manor, trapping us together in the candlelit intimacy of the great hall. I realized with growing alarm that every moment I remained in her presence was a step further from the safe, professional distance I had maintained for so many months. Yet as I looked into Catherine's eyes, seeing the courage and vulnerability there, I knew I was already lost. Whatever the cost to my reputation or peace of mind, I could not abandon her to Mortimer's machinations. The widow I had sworn to avoid had indeed come closer, and I found myself powerless to step back. The silence that followed her words stretched between us like a bridge I was terrified to cross. I rose from my chair and moved to the fireplace, needing the distance to think clearly. The flames cast dancing shadows across the stone hearth, and I found myself studying their patterns rather than meeting her gaze. Catherine, I began, then stopped. Even her name felt dangerous on my lips. Lady Pembroke, you must understand the position you are asking me to take. To challenge Lord Mortimer's claim would require not just legal expertise, but substantial resources and social standing. She moved closer, and I caught the faint scent of lavender that always seemed to surround her. It was maddening how such a simple thing could unravel my composure so completely. I know what I am asking, she said quietly. And I know it seems presumptuous. But Tobias, you have managed the most complex estates in England. You have turned failing properties into profitable enterprises. If anyone can find a legal solution to this predicament, it is you. The way she spoke my name sent warmth spreading through my chest despite my attempts to maintain professional distance. I had been Mr. Ashworth to her for 3 years, even during the monthly meetings when I consulted on Ravenscroft's accounts. This intimacy was new, dangerous, and utterly compelling. Very well, I said, turning to face her fully. Show me the documents. Let me understand exactly what we are dealing with. Relief flooded her features, transforming her from the composed lady of the manor into something far more vulnerable and human. She led me through the shadowed corridors to the estate's library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes. Several candles had been arranged on the massive oak table, creating a pool of golden light in the otherwise dark space. I have gathered everything here, she said, gesturing to neat stacks of papers and ledgers. My husband's correspondence, the estate accounts, legal documents dating back generations. I confess I have tried to make sense of it all myself, but the legal language is often beyond my understanding. As we settled at the table, I became acutely aware of our proximity. The candlelight cast a warm glow across her features, highlighting the intelligence in her dark eyes and the graceful curve of her neck. When she leaned forward to point out specific documents, her shoulder brushed against mine, and I had to force myself to concentrate on the papers before us. Tell me about your husband's business dealings, I said, pulling the first ledger toward me. What ventures was he involved in beyond the estate itself? Catherine hesitated, and I sensed there were painful memories associated with this topic. Richard was, how shall I put this delicately, somewhat impulsive in his investments. He had grand visions of expanding our holdings, of establishing trade relationships that would increase our wealth dramatically. I opened the ledger and began scanning the entries. Even in the flickering candlelight, the pattern became clear quickly. Large sums invested in shipping ventures that had failed, payments to dubious associates for schemes that had never materialized, loans taken against the estate's future income. How much did you know about these activities while your husband was alive? I asked carefully. Very little, she admitted. Richard kept his business affairs separate from estate management. I handled the daily operations, the tenants, the household accounts. He managed what he called the larger financial picture. Her voice carried a note of bitterness that spoke to months of discovery and regret. As we worked through the documents, our hands occasionally touched as we reached for the same papers. Each contact sent awareness shooting through my system, making concentration increasingly difficult. The intimate setting, the candlelight, the way she bit her lower lip when concentrating, all combined to create an atmosphere charged with possibility and danger. Here, she said, pulling a letter from beneath a stack of invoices. This is Mortimer's formal notice of his intentions. I read the document with growing anger. Mortimer's language was coldly legal, but his intentions were clear. He would claim the estate through right of debt collection, forcing Catherine to accept his protection and guidance in all future matters. The final paragraph made his expectations brutally explicit. He mentions a suitable marriage arrangement, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Sir Geoffrey Whitmore, Catherine replied, and I heard the distaste in her voice. A wealthy landowner from the North Country. He is 53 years old, has buried 2 wives already, and has a reputation for cruelty toward his household staff. The thought of Catherine bound to such a man filled me with rage so pure and sudden that I had to grip the edge of the table to maintain control. The candlelight flickered as if responding to the tension in the room. There must be a legal challenge we can mount, I said. Some precedent, some technicality that would prevent this forced arrangement. We spent the next hour poring over legal documents, searching for any weakness in Mortimer's position. Catherine proved to be far more knowledgeable about legal matters than she had initially suggested, offering insights that revealed a sharp intelligence behind her modest claims of ignorance. You understand these concepts quite well for someone who claims confusion about legal language, I observed. She smiled, and for the first time since my arrival, genuine warmth reached her eyes. I may have understated my capabilities slightly. When one is managing an estate largely alone, one learns to read legal documents out of necessity. Then why did you really summon me here tonight? I asked. It was not merely for my expertise, was it? The question hung between us in the candlelit air. Catherine set down the document she had been holding and looked directly into my eyes. In that moment, I saw past the careful composure she maintained, past the proper behavior expected of a widow in mourning, to something raw and honest that made my heart pound against my ribs. Because, she said softly, during the 3 years you managed our accounts, during every monthly meeting we shared, I came to trust you more than any other person in my life. Because when Richard died and I found myself truly alone for the first time, yours was the face I thought of when I imagined safety. Her words hit me like lightning, illuminating feelings I had tried desperately to suppress. I had convinced myself that my attraction to her was one-sided, that my professional admiration had inappropriately transformed into something more personal. But the way she looked at me now suggested something entirely different. Catherine, I whispered, forgetting all pretense of formal address. You cannot know what you are saying. The scandal alone would destroy both our reputations. I know exactly what I am saying, she replied, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. And I know that in 3 days, when Mortimer arrives with his magistrate and his legal documents, I will lose not only my home but any choice in my future. If I am to be ruined, let it be by my own decision rather than his manipulation. The candles had burned lower during our conversation, casting longer shadows across the library walls. Outside, the storm continued its assault, and I realized that we were truly cut off from the world, alone in a way that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. Her skin was warm despite the chill in the room, and I felt her fingers tremble slightly at the contact. Then we will find another way, I said. I swear to you, Catherine, I will not let Mortimer force you into an unwanted marriage. Whatever it takes, whatever the cost, we will find a solution that preserves your independence and your dignity. She turned her hand beneath mine, lacing our fingers together in a gesture that felt both innocent and utterly intimate. And what of us, Tobias? What of these feelings that have grown between us despite every attempt at propriety? Before I could answer, we heard the distant sound of horses approaching through the storm. Catherine's eyes widened with alarm, and we both froze, listening to the commotion in the courtyard below. The sound of approaching horses sent ice through my veins that had nothing to do with the winter storm. Catherine's hand tightened in mine, and I saw fear flash across her features before she quickly composed herself. "It cannot be Mortimer," she whispered. "He is not expected for 3 days yet." We moved to the library window, peering through the frost-covered glass into the courtyard below. Through the swirling snow, I could make out the shapes of several mounted figures, their dark forms barely visible against the white backdrop. My heart hammered as I watched them dismount and approach the manor's entrance. "Travelers seeking shelter from the storm," I said, though uncertainty colored my voice. It would be the charitable thing to provide refuge on such a night. Catherine nodded, but I noticed how her free hand trembled slightly as she smoothed her skirts. We had been caught in a moment of dangerous intimacy, and the arrival of unexpected guests would require us to resume the proper distance that society demanded. "I should greet them," she said, though she made no move to release my hand. "We should greet them," I corrected. "As your estate manager, my presence here is perfectly legitimate." We made our way through the corridors toward the main entrance, our footsteps echoing in the candlelit hallways. The wind howled around the manor's stone walls, and I could hear the heavy oak doors creaking under the storm's assault. Mrs. Hartwell had already answered the summons, and her voice carried clearly through the great hall as she welcomed the unexpected visitors. Relief flooded through me as I recognized the educated accent of gentlemen travelers rather than the harsh tones I associated with Mortimer's associates. "Lady Pembroke," called a familiar voice that made Catherine's posture straighten with recognition. "I do apologize for this intrusion, but the storm has made travel impossible." As we entered the hall, I saw 3 men removing their snow-covered cloaks. The speaker was Sir James Rothwell, a neighboring landowner whose estate bordered Ravenscroft's southern boundary. With him were his son Marcus and their family solicitor, Mr. Blackwood. "Sir James," Catherine said, genuine warmth in her voice as she moved forward to greet them properly. "You are most welcome. Mrs. Hartwell, please prepare chambers for our guests and see that their horses are properly cared for." Sir James was a man in his late 50s, distinguished and respected throughout the county. His presence here tonight could be either fortunate coincidence or something more purposeful. As Catherine performed the necessary introductions, I noted how his sharp eyes took in every detail of our situation. "Mr. Ashworth," he said, shaking my hand firmly. "I had not expected to find you here during such weather." "Estate business," I replied carefully. "Lady Pembroke requested consultation on some financial matters that required immediate attention." "Indeed," Sir James said, and something in his tone suggested he understood more than he was revealing. "Perhaps we might continue this conversation before the fire. The storm shows no signs of abating, and we may be here longer than any of us anticipated." As we settled in the great hall, Mrs. Hartwell appeared with warming drinks and the promise of a hot meal despite the lateness of the hour. The atmosphere had shifted dramatically from the intimate tension Catherine and I had shared in the library to the formal politeness required by mixed company. "Tell me, Lady Pembroke," Sir James began once we were all comfortable, "how are you managing during these difficult months? The loss of a husband is always challenging, but particularly so during winter when travel and communication become so restricted." Catherine handled the inquiry with grace, but I caught the subtle warning in Sir James's question. He was probing, trying to understand her current situation and perhaps her future plans. "I am managing well, thank you," she replied. "The estate continues to prosper under careful stewardship, and I have been blessed with reliable assistance." Marcus Rothwell, a young man of perhaps 25, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Perhaps too well, some might say. There are those who question whether a woman alone can truly manage such responsibilities without proper masculine guidance." The comment struck like a physical blow, and I saw Catherine's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Here was the social pressure she faced daily, the assumption that her competence was somehow inadequate simply because of her gender. "I believe Lady Pembroke has demonstrated remarkable capability," I said, my voice carefully controlled. "The estate's financial records speak clearly to her management skills." Mr. Blackwood, the solicitor, looked up from warming his hands by the fire. "Financial records can be deceiving, Mr. Ashworth. What appears profitable on paper may hide underlying vulnerabilities, particularly when a woman lacks the legal protections that proper masculine oversight provides." The conversation was moving in a direction that made my skin crawl with warning. These men had not sought shelter by accident. They were here for a purpose, and that purpose seemed centered on Catherine's future. "I trust," Sir James said smoothly, "that you are considering your long-term security, Lady Pembroke. A woman in your position faces unique challenges that might be best addressed through prudent alliance." Catherine's eyes met mine across the firelit space, and I saw the same realization dawning in her expression. These were not random travelers seeking shelter. They were suitors, or perhaps representatives of suitors, testing the waters of her availability and desperation. "I appreciate your concern," Catherine replied, her voice steady despite what must have been growing alarm. "However, I am quite content with my current circumstances." "Circumstances can change rapidly," Marcus said, his tone carrying an edge that made my muscles tense. "Particularly when certain family members begin asserting their legal rights." The mention of family rights could only refer to one thing. Somehow, word of Mortimer's intentions had reached the neighboring estates. These men knew about the threat she faced, and they were positioning themselves accordingly. "Perhaps," Sir James suggested, "we might discuss these matters more privately. Some conversations are best conducted without unnecessary witnesses." His eyes fixed on me with unmistakable meaning. They wanted me gone, removed from the equation so they could pressure Catherine without interference. The protective instinct that had been building in my chest all evening flared into something approaching rage. "Mr. Ashworth is privy to all estate matters," Catherine said firmly. "I have no secrets from my trusted advisor." The word "trusted" carried weight that was not lost on any of the men present. She was making it clear that my opinion carried influence with her, that any discussions would include my perspective whether they preferred it or not. "Mr. Blackwood cleared his throat pointedly. "Lady Pembroke, I feel obligated to mention that Lord Mortimer Pembroke has been making inquiries about your situation. He has consulted with several legal experts regarding his rights as the late Lord Pembroke's brother." "And what conclusions have these experts reached?" I asked, unable to keep the challenge from my voice. "That his position is quite strong," the solicitor replied. "Particularly given the estate's current financial obligations." The room fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and the wind howling outside. Everyone present understood the implications. Mortimer's legal challenge was not merely threatened but actively being pursued, with the advice and support of established legal minds. "However," Sir James said after a moment, "there are alternatives that might provide better protection for Lady Pembroke's interests." Catherine straightened in her chair, and I saw her preparing for whatever proposal was coming. The candlelight played across her features, highlighting the determined set of her jaw and the intelligence in her eyes. "What alternatives?" she asked. "Marriage," Marcus said bluntly. "To a man with the social standing and financial resources to challenge Mortimer's claims legally." The word hung in the air like a sword suspended over our heads. I felt something cold and violent settle in my stomach as I realized they were about to make their play for Catherine's hand and fortune. "Someone," Sir James added with a meaningful look at his son, "who could provide immediate protection and long-term security." I watched Catherine's face carefully, looking for any sign of her thoughts. Her expression remained perfectly composed, but I caught the slight tremor in her hands as she folded them in her lap. She was trapped, and we all knew it. The proposal hung in the air like smoke from the fireplace, thick and suffocating. I watched Catherine's face, searching for any indication of her thoughts, but she maintained the perfect composure that years of navigating society had taught her. "You are most kind to concern yourselves with my welfare," she said finally, her voice carrying just the right note of gratitude without commitment. "However, I believe such momentous decisions require careful consideration rather than hasty resolution." Marcus leaned forward eagerly, apparently interpreting her diplomatic response as encouragement. "Of course, Lady Pembroke. But given the urgency of Lord Mortimer's intentions, perhaps expedient action would be preferable to prolonged deliberation." I felt my hands clench into fists and forced myself to relax them. These men were circling Catherine like vultures, offering protection that came with its own chains. The worst part was that their proposal might actually be the most sensible solution to her predicament, and that knowledge burned in my chest like acid. "Tell me, Mr. Blackwood," I interjected, drawing the solicitor's attention. "What legal standing would such a marriage provide against Lord Mortimer's claims?" The lawyer's eyes sharpened with professional interest. "A husband would have complete authority over his wife's property and legal matters. Lord Mortimer's claims would have to be directed toward the new head of household rather than a vulnerable widow." "And the debts that form the basis of his claim?" Catherine asked. "Would become the responsibility of the new husband," Sir James replied smoothly. A man of substantial means could either settle them immediately or negotiate more favorable terms. I noticed how neither Marcus nor his father had mentioned the specific amounts involved. They were assuming the debts could be managed, but they had not seen the detailed accounting that Catherine and I had reviewed. The numbers were substantial enough to strain even a wealthy man's resources. "Might I ask," I said carefully, "what your family's assessment of the estate's total obligations would be?" Mr. Blackwood reached into his travel bag and withdrew a leather portfolio. "We have obtained copies of the relevant documents. Our preliminary review suggests the debts total approximately £12,000. Catherine's sharp intake of breath was barely audible, but I caught it. The figure he quoted was significantly lower than what we had calculated from the complete records. Either their information was incomplete, or they were deliberately understating the magnitude of the problem. "That seems rather conservative," I observed. "Have you had access to the complete estate records?" "The essential documents," Sir James replied with a dismissive wave. "Enough to understand the scope of the challenge." I exchanged a quick glance with Catherine. If they were operating on incomplete information, their proposal might not provide the protection they promised. More importantly, their willingness to proceed without full knowledge suggested they were more interested in acquiring the estate than in truly helping Catherine. "Perhaps," Catherine said with admirable calm, "we should examine all the relevant papers together. Mr. Ashworth has been conducting a comprehensive review of our situation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Marcus's eager expression shifted to something harder, and his father's genial mask slipped slightly. "I am sure Mr. Ashworth has been most thorough," Sir James said, his tone carrying a subtle warning. "However, these are matters that might be better discussed between principals rather than agents." The dismissal was clear and insulting. They were telling me, not so subtly, that my presence was no longer welcome in their negotiations. The implication that I was merely hired help, easily discarded when convenient, made my blood simmer. "Mr. Ashworth is not merely an agent," Catherine said, steel entering her voice for the first time that evening. "He is my most trusted advisor, and I value his counsel above all others." The declaration sent warmth flooding through my chest even as it raised the stakes of our situation considerably. By defending my position so firmly, Catherine was making it clear that any suitor would have to contend with my influence. Marcus's face darkened with obvious displeasure. "Lady Pembroke, surely you understand that excessive reliance on subordinates can create unfortunate impressions about your judgment." The insult was subtle but unmistakable. He was suggesting that Catherine's trust in me reflected poorly on her character and decision-making ability. I saw her posture stiffen with offense, and I knew the young man had made a serious tactical error. "I understand," Catherine replied, her voice now carrying an edge that could cut glass, "that my judgment has successfully managed this estate for 3 years with results that speak for themselves. I also understand that any future alliance I might consider would need to respect rather than dismiss the relationships I value." Sir James must have recognized that his son had overplayed their hand, because he quickly moved to smooth the waters. "Of course, Lady Pembroke. We meant no disrespect to your excellent management or your choice of advisors. But the damage was done." The mask had slipped, revealing the arrogance and entitlement that lay beneath their courteous proposal. They wanted Catherine's estate and were willing to offer marriage as the price, but they had no intention of treating her as an equal partner in the arrangement. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway to announce that chambers had been prepared for the unexpected guests. The interruption provided a natural break in the increasingly tense conversation, and everyone seemed grateful for the respite. "Perhaps we should all retire," Catherine suggested. "The storm may have passed by morning, allowing for clearer thinking and better travel conditions." As our guests gathered their belongings and prepared to follow Mrs. Hartwell to their rooms, Sir James approached Catherine for a private word. I stepped back to provide the appearance of privacy while remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. "My dear Lady Pembroke," he said quietly, "I hope you will not let pride prevent you from accepting help when it is genuinely offered. The world can be harsh to women who attempt to stand alone. And equally harsh to those who surrender their independence too quickly," Catherine replied. "I appreciate your concern, Sir James, but I am not yet ready to abandon hope of finding a solution that preserves both my security and my autonomy." He studied her face in the candlelight, and I saw something like admiration flicker in his expression. "Very well. But remember that time is not on your side. Lord Mortimer will not be as patient or as generous in his terms." After our guests had retired, Catherine and I found ourselves alone again in the great hall. The fire had burned low, casting longer shadows across the stone walls, and the storm outside seemed to have intensified. Well, she said with a weary sigh, that was illuminating. Indeed. They know more about Mortimer's plans than they initially revealed, and they are clearly positioning themselves to benefit from your predicament. Catherine moved to the window, gazing out at the swirling snow. Marcus Rothwell is not a cruel man, but he is weak and easily influenced by his father's ambitions. Marriage to him would solve my immediate problems while creating entirely new ones. I joined her at the window, standing close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that always surrounded her. What new problems? I would become a possession rather than a partner. My opinions would be dismissed, my management skills discarded, my very identity subsumed into his family's interests. She turned to face me, and in her eyes I saw a desperation that she had hidden from our visitors. Is that truly better than whatever fate Mortimer has planned? The question struck me like a physical blow. Here was a woman of remarkable intelligence and capability being forced to choose between different forms of subjugation. The injustice of it filled me with rage so pure and fierce that I had to grip the window frame to maintain control. There must be another way, I said. Some legal precedent, some financial solution that would preserve your independence. What if there is not? She asked softly. What if my choices are limited to selecting the least objectionable form of surrender? I turned to face her fully, and in that moment, standing in the candlelit intimacy of the storm-bound manor, I made a decision that would change both our lives forever. Catherine, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, there is another way. One that neither the Rothwells nor Mortimer have considered. She looked at me with questioning eyes, and I saw hope kindle there despite her attempts to remain guarded. The candlelight played across her features, highlighting the strength I had always admired and the vulnerability she rarely allowed others to see. Marry me. The words hung between us like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. I watched her face transform through surprise, disbelief, and something that looked remarkably like joy before settling into careful consideration. Tobias, she said softly, you cannot know what you are offering. The scandal alone would destroy your reputation. A gentleman of your standing, marrying so far above his social position, would be accused of fortune hunting. Let them accuse, I replied, stepping closer until I could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. I have built my reputation on honest work and fair dealing. Those who know me will understand my motivations. Those who do not are not worth considering. But the debts, she protested. The financial obligations that form the basis of Mortimer's claim. You have seen the numbers, Tobias. They would consume your entire fortune and leave us both in poverty. I reached into my coat and withdrew a small leather portfolio I had brought with me. I have been more successful in my investments than most people realize. 3 years ago, I took a significant stake in a shipping venture that has proved extraordinarily profitable. Last month, I received notification that my share of the proceeds amounts to nearly £18,000. Her eyes widened with shock. 18,000? But how did you come by such an opportunity? Your late husband mentioned the venture during one of our meetings. When he decided not to invest, I saw the merit in his research and made the commitment myself. It seems his business instincts were better than his ability to follow through on them. Catherine stared at me for a long moment, processing this revelation. You have the means to settle the estate's debts and challenge Mortimer's claim. More than sufficient means, I confirmed. But Catherine, you must understand something crucial. I am not offering this solution merely to save you from an unwanted marriage. I am offering it because I have been in love with you since the first day we met 3 years ago. The confession hung between us like a lit fuse. I watched her face carefully, searching for any sign of her reaction. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible above the wind outside. Even when I was married to Richard. Especially then, I admitted. Do you know how many sleepless nights I spent wrestling with guilt over my feelings for another man's wife? How many times I considered ending our professional relationship to spare myself the torment of loving someone I could never have? Tears sparkled in her eyes, but whether from joy or sorrow I could not tell. Why did you never speak of this? Because honor demanded silence. Because your husband was a good man who trusted me with his most precious possessions. Because I believed my feelings were my burden to bear alone. She reached up and touched my face gently, her fingers tracing the line of my jaw. You beautiful, honorable fool. Did you never notice how I found excuses to extend our monthly meetings? How I always dressed with particular care on the days you were expected. How I asked Mrs. Hartwell to serve your favorite tea and prepare the foods you mentioned enjoying. Her words hit me like lightning, illuminating 3 years of interactions in an entirely new light. I thought you were simply being a gracious hostess. I was being a woman desperately in love with a man she could not have, Catherine said, stepping closer until we were almost touching. Richard knew. He told me on his deathbed that he had seen the way we looked at each other and that he bore no resentment. He said that if I could find happiness after his death, particularly with someone who would treasure me as I deserved, he would consider his own life well lived. The revelation staggered me. Not only had her husband known of our feelings, but he had given his blessing to a future we had never dared imagine. The guilt that had tormented me for years dissolved like ice in summer sunshine. Then there is no impediment, I said, taking her hands in mine. No moral obstacle, no financial barrier, no social convention that matters more than our happiness. There is still the matter of Mortimer, she reminded me. He will not abandon his claim simply because I marry someone he considers beneath my station. Then we will fight him legally and socially, I replied. My connections in London include several prominent solicitors who specialize in estate law. More importantly, Sir James and his son have revealed that word of Mortimer's plans has spread throughout the county. If we move quickly, we can present our marriage as a love match that incidentally provides protection rather than a desperate arrangement made under duress. Catherine smiled for the first time since our guests had arrived, and the expression transformed her entire face. You have thought this through thoroughly. I have had 3 years to consider every possible scenario that might allow us to be together. The storm tonight simply provided the opportunity to act on those plans. She laughed softly, a sound that filled me with more joy than I had ever thought possible. So this evening's intimate dinner was not the spontaneous result of unexpected circumstances. The dinner was unplanned, I admitted. But the feelings it revealed have been carefully tended for longer than I care to admit. Outside, the wind began to subside, and through the window I could see the first hints of dawn touching the eastern sky. The storm that had brought us together was finally passing, but the intimacy it had created would endure far beyond the weather. There is one more thing we must consider, Catherine said, though her eyes sparkled with mischief rather than concern. Mrs. Hartwell will be scandalized when she discovers that her proper lady and respectable gentleman spent the night discussing estate business until dawn. Then we must give her something even more scandalous to discuss, I replied, pulling Catherine into my arms. Such as our engagement. Our lips met in a kiss that carried 3 years of suppressed longing and the promise of a lifetime together. When we finally broke apart, both of us were breathless and laughing. I believe, Catherine said, that Mrs. Hartwell will find our engagement considerably more acceptable than our unchaperoned evening. 3 months later, as spring brought new life to the countryside around Ravenscroft Manor, Catherine and I stood before the altar of the village church and spoke vows that made legal what our hearts had known for years. Mortimer had indeed challenged our marriage, but faced with legal representation I had procured and the united support of our neighbors, his claims had crumbled like autumn leaves. As we walked back to the manor as husband and wife, Catherine carrying a bouquet of the first spring flowers, I reflected on the lesson that winter storm had taught us. Sometimes the very circumstances we seek to avoid become the catalysts for our greatest happiness. The widow I had sworn to avoid had indeed come closer that candlelit night, and my inability to step back had led us both toward a love more fulfilling than either of us had dared imagine. That evening, as Catherine lit the candles for our first dinner as a married couple, I realized that candlelight would forever remind us not of the dangerous attraction we had once fought, but of the moment when we finally stopped fighting and allowed ourselves to embrace the love that had been waiting in the shadows all along. By candlelight, we had found our way to each other, and by candlelight, we would build a life together that honored both passion and propriety, love and commitment, desire and devotion.